So this portrait that we're looking at is by August Sander, German photographer. The portrait is titled Secretary at a Radio Station, Cologne, and it's from about 1931.
Now, let me see if I can remember this, because it's been a long time. Sander was trying to create these photographic sort of perfect representations of types of people or types of occupations. Is that right?
Exactly.
Almost these sort of platonic ideals.
I don't know if they're platonic. I think you could refer to them as forms or original forms. I think he's interested in looking at people in Germany as of particular occupational or professional classes. So that they're types. There are a lot of different things that can be drawn from this.
So it's not a physiological
Well, it's
representation.
related to physiognomy and who people are in terms of what they do.
Okay.
Is this related at all to the physiologies that the
Yes.
French did in
Yes.
the mid and 19th century?
And yes, I mean, Sander did not have strong theories about one type of person looking or necessarily being better or more pure than another. That really wasn't his project. He was trained and worked as a portrait photographer in the early 20th century, and this portrait is 1931, so for a number of years he was doing straight portrait photographs, being paid for them in his studio.
Okay.
And then he becomes more interested in a kind of clinical gaze.
So like saying that a person's occupation actually forms their physiognomy in a way?
In a way, yes. I mean, if you look at somebody's hands,
Right.
A worker, a farmer, for example, would have hands that look much different from an accountant's hands.
And perhaps the way that they hold themselves, the
Right.
kind
Totally,
of
they
dress that
carry
they place
themselves.
themselves in.
Absolutely.
So it's the entire sort of representation of the person.
Right. It's sort of he's trying to get a complete picture and sort of look at these connections, like how do we hold ourselves and how do we present ourselves, and it is about sort of public persona because it's profession.
So can I ask a sort of a technical
What year
question?
is this, though?
This is 31.
So this is sort of his type of secretary at a radio station. Would he have photographed a whole series of secretaries and then looked for one that was most ideal in some way?
He did a series of women.
Okay.
And so then there are different types of women that are
Like what?
well, farming women, women that are artists, there are professional women, intellectual women. This is probably a
Lower middle class.
lower middle class, or it's sort of a new salaried.
Yes.
Woman in the
Salaried
workforce.
woman.
That
It's-
new threatening.
It's exactly. I mean,
new woman.
she is the new woman, and she has all of the trappings of that archetype.
Did
That-
he do a series of men? Because there's a kind of long history in photography going back to Munby of men photographing, women and looking at different types of women and especially fetishizing working class women.
Actually, it goes before
That's
photography.
Before-
think
yeah.
back to Degas.
That's-
think back to,
well,
that's not before photography, but
right.
I mean, just this whole notion
Right.
of the scintillating quality of
The working
right.
woman.
Yeah.
He had, I think, a wider gaze than that. He's looking across professions. So he has a couple of books and exhibitions that come out in the 20s and 30s. And the one that was published in 1929 was called Faces of the Time.
Ah.
And that was a collection of 60 photographs. And it was intended to be...
Is it men and women?
It's men and women, yes. It's
okay.
Faces of our time in general, and it organizes people by class or by occupation. And so he starts off with farmers. He began to take photographs of all these farmers in the Westerwald region in Germany. And that's kind of where he came up with all these different kinds of farmers, like young farmers and old farmers and big, huge families of farmers and farmers that are rich and farmers that are poor. He's looking at it really as a kind of scientific project. It's a sociological, anthropological study of all these. And he feels like, especially in the 20s, like to make sense of the changing German culture.
Right.
And to make sense of all these different new things, new different types of people that are appearing, one way to kind of make sense of it all is to try to organize them.
It's almost a
Right.
kind of documentation.
Categorize
It's a
it.
huge project of documentation. It's very German.
In a curious way, it reminds me of the Beschers later.
Yes, well,
You know?
the Beschers come out of that.
Yeah.
In
Because-
what way? How does it remind you
Well,
of the Beschers?
this notion of really trying to document and understand through a kind of almost encyclopedic.
It's exactly coming from this exact kind of imagery. The Beschers are looking at Sander's project and other German photographers of this period. That idea that you're constantly looking very closely, clinically at,
Dispassionately.
dispassionately.
that so reminds me of a kind of 19th century positivist tradition of, sort of scientific categorizing, species and,
Yes.
putting things
Yeah.
in category.
It comes out in how he organizes everything, but he's not going about this as
It's not moralizing.
It's not, no, he's
in
not
any way.
specifically
And in
moralized.
So,
fact,
which makes this project more modern,
Yeah.
because that
Yes.
is not
And
there.
there's also, I mean, it may be
And also artistic.
that's
Right.
true, but there may be a thin veil of it, but nevertheless, he's hanging on to
Well,
a
let's
kind
look
of
at some
neutrality.
of the other ones.
There's great. I mean, this
Oh,
pastry
fabulous.
chef. And this is maybe a little bit more telling about the idea that it's a profession, that he's of a specific profession, because you see him with the tools of his trade. The image we looked at before, that the new woman has tools of her trade, but they're a little bit less obvious. So he has his outfit on. He has his pastry chef, the white jacket.
Are they often shot in this way, like straight on?
Yes, mostly full portraits or three-quarter length.
I mean, at least these two are both somewhat confrontational.
The subjects generally look directly at the camera, and they sort of have that kind of dialogue with the photographer. And it's often very, like there's some sort of pride. They're not, they're sort of presenting their public selves. It's hard to read.
There's a kind of mask, a kind
It
of
is.
professional
It's a
mask.
professional
in a
mask that
way.
you sort of take up. But, he's sort of almost like paused in the middle of something, but it also
Right.
looks posed, right? Saunders definitely posing him. He's got light set up in a certain
Yeah.
way. That it's really contrasty. It brings out the white of his jacket. And then there's sort of silver, and there's sort of the gleam of the
Yeah,
bowl.
and it's also so carefully composed, these lines of bins or whatever they are that sort of come and meet toward his head.
Yep.
It's drawing our attention to his face. It's that diagonal line of his hand going toward the corner with the spoon.
And his body takes up a significant amount of space within the image.
It's really a beautifully composed image.
It is. His
Yeah.
portraits are even more striking because of that.
Here's another one. What's this one called?
This is called Disabled Man.
So this is really only a
Or
few
is it
years after the
26?
end of the First World War, and disability was incredibly public, right?
It was. And this, I always think, is very striking and I kind of an ironic portrait.
Yeah, he's,
right?
he's in front of the stairs, right.
And he's not really sure if he has legs or what
Right.
part of his legs are left. So he
Right.
doesn't have prosthetics. Likely he has this kind of half wheelchair sort of cart thing, and he sort of gazes out, perhaps a little
Reproachfully.
reproachfully at
Yeah.
the photographer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's also, again, just a lovely composition with the diagonal line of the stairs and
The perspective is
Yeah.
really striking.
Yeah.
It really sort of
Yeah.
brings your attention. I mean, you can't help but look at the stairs and then look back at the figure
Right.
who's...
Well, and there's this really interesting sort of mix between the tragic and the beautiful, and it really makes it an enormously sort of powerful combination, and there's an attempt by the subject to retrieve a degree of dignity in his posture, in
He's
in the
upright.
suit coat.
And he's staring straight out at the photographer as well, and I like that kind of confrontational look. He's meeting our gaze, and he sort of looks... I feel like I'm looking right at him. When I look at the image.
And at his
He's
level,
very present,
the
very alive.
The photographer was down. It's not looking. It appears
not looking down
It's
at
not
him.
looking
Right.
down at him, even though he's at a lower level. We've assumed a kind of crouch, so that we're looking across. At least that's what the orthogonal seems to suggest.
I think
Right.
his arms are up. He's not slouched.
Yeah.
And he's, there are other disabled war veterans who had these little carts that were just basically like skateboards, and they would push themselves on the ground.
yeah.
And you can see a lot of those in paintings of the early 1920s.
But this is somebody who the public might have tried to avert their gaze from, and
Well,
to,
that's
and
the
to
Probably,
put, and,
yes.
to, and to put this person sort of front and center in a photograph as a subject of our gaze is a pretty powerful.
And I think, knowing what we know is going to happen a few years from this,
Yes.
that people who are disabled in all sorts of ways are,
Going to be
the Nazis
yes.
try to, destroy that image of the imperfect
Right.
body.
Yeah,
Right.
I think it's that the sense of this is in the public. What do they do with this kind of person that you sort of push them away, push them off to the side. And I'm not trying to make Sonder out as some
Right.
sort of...
It's not first
It's
image.
not the first image. It's not with sort of more heroicized farmers. It's not. He's not with the intellectual types. He's sort of... Sonder does turn his camera on all different
So this is
people
part of
in
that
society, but
encyclopedic quality.
it is encyclopedic.
Yeah.
But he's probably in a similar section as the unemployed. He's not sort of held up.
What's interesting to me, though, is that if this image had been, filled more with pathos, if it had been more pitying, more emotional in some way, Sander might not be part of the modernist canon.
Right.
Right? It's this kind of detached gaze that's so much of a part of what modernism is. And as soon as sentiment enters into it, or manipulation in some way, it's not, it blurs that line.
That's right, because the narrative is inserted then in a very direct way, and the modernist aesthetic rejects this.
Right. Which is weird.
But what's interesting is that there really is a narrative here. I mean, this man is, and the wounded are really a representation of Germany's failure during the First World War, their loss.
Right, or at least that's how we're reading it.
Yeah.
That's how I always look at it, as a disabled man from
the war.
Yeah. And he could be disabled from something else entirely.
Right.
But
there
just
were so
that
many
image, there were so many
right.
images that it just sort of becomes symbolic of that. But I think, one of the things that Sander did that was great was use this sort of clinical scientific gaze where he sort of kind of wanted to organize all these images, and it kind of brings out this tension between science and art that I think is really, really important in photography. And it's that tension that I think makes the images so wonderful and so striking, that you really look at this sort of stark image that doesn't seem coated with sentiment, yet also has, sort of conventions of beauty and
photography itself is scientific in some way.
Right, and there's still, sort of the mechanical.
Right.
And I think one of the things that Sander was able to do, and one of the reasons why he started creating these images, is that he accidentally printed on a different kind of paper in about 1920. And it really does make a difference, like the kind of paper that you print on when you create a photograph. Now we have digital images and we print on anything really.
Right.
Really, this kind of image versus a carbon print versus gum bichromate print versus, any other kind of earlier photograph, those are much more sort of fuzzy, they're blurry. It has a sense of the artistic or the pictorial.
Right.
Once you start printing on paper that has more neutral tones or even cold tones, it takes on that kind of scientific documentary gaze, so that you're looking at things and they seem more objective, and they kind of take up that guise, and whether or not they are or not, we end up reading them
in that way.
But they also, for photography, might have functioned in some way, I guess this is a question, did they function in some way as a way of divorcing photography from painting? And in a sense, giving photography a kind of autonomy, a kind of aesthetic autonomy, maybe allied with science, that really finally brought it away from those pictorial traditions in which it had been embedded.
That was, I think, really exciting for artists, photographers in the 20s. The idea of the new, that photography, that was one of the reasons it was so appealing, is that it's a technology of modernity. It's of the new, it's of science. It has nothing to do with, or so they wanted to think, of painting and of the old and of traditions mired in the past.
You could really create from it something entirely new and of the modern era.
Except that all the vocabulary that we've been using is embedded in the history of art and the history of painting.
Because what makes an image successful is just what makes an image successful in a way, whether what we're looking at.
It's true, although embedded in its own sort of technological and historical moment. Yeah.
Yes.
What a terrific image.